today we are immersing ourselves in just a seismic voice in anti-colonial thought, that Aimé Césaire.
We're looking specifically at his monumental 1955 essay, Discourse on Colonialism. And, well, calling it an essay almost doesn't do it justice.
No, not at all. I mean, this isn't some polite academic paper. It's brutal. It's an unforgiving, almost surgical indictment of European morality, of European civilization itself.
Right. And Césaire, for those less familiar, was a poet, a major political figure for Martinique, and crucially, a co-founder of the Negritude movement.
Yeah, and we're actually pairing the discourse with an illuminating later interview. In it, he outlines the kind of political and poetic project that he saw as a solution, really, to the moral void that empire created.
Okay, so our mission today, let's nail this down. We want to unpack Césaire's core thesis, which is pretty electrifying stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
He argues that colonization isn't just a tragedy for the people being colonized, which is obvious enough, but that it's a catastrophic failure for the colonizer, too.
How so?
Well, he says it inevitably dehumanizes the oppressors themselves. And this leads directly, he argues, to Europe's own profound spiritual and moral decline.
And he doesn't ease you into it, does he? He hits you right away with this declaration that, I mean, even reading it now, almost 70 years later, it just stops you cold.
Europe is indefensible, just flat out.
Wow.
And that statement just sets the tone for everything that follows. He clarifies, that Western civilization, especially as it's been shaped by the European bourgeoisie over 2 centuries, has become, well, morally and spiritually stricken.
Stricken because?
Because it's fundamentally incapable, he says, of resolving 2 critical problems that it actually created itself. The internal problem of the proletariat.
Okay, class struggle at home.
Right. And the external colonial problem. Exploitation abroad.
So if a civilization creates this, immense global wealth, but at the same time it can't fix the poverty of its own working class, and it relies on enslaving and exploiting millions overseas,
then it's decadent. It's dying. That's his argument. The whole system is built on, well, ethical bankruptcy. It's founded, as he puts it, on trickery and deceit.
And it's that hypocrisy, that sort of moral fiction that he really wants to just strip bare, right? Starting with what he calls the principal lie.
Exactly. Let's get into that.
Okay, so let's jump right into the heart of this critique. Césaire insists the mission is to see clearly, to think clearly, that is, dangerously. A civilization that can't solve its own problems is decadent. But what's the specific persistent lie used to cover this up?
Well, the lie is essentially the pretense that colonization is anything other than just naked violence, opportunism, and, well, greed.
Yeah.
He uses this almost poetic string of negatives to define it.
Right, he says what it isn't.
Exactly. Colonization is not evangelization. It's not some philanthropic enterprise. It's not about pushing back ignorance or disease. And it's definitely not a project for the glory of God.
That just sweeps away centuries of justification, doesn't it? I mean, the whole mission civilisatrice in France,
Right.
the white man's burden idea.
All of it. He completely rejects any notion of a noble purpose. He's basically saying history's been rewritten by the winners to cloak these really brutal economic motives in a kind of sanctimonious morality.
So if you strip away all that lofty talk, who are the real players? The decisive actors Césaire points to.
He's very clear. It's the people who profit directly and ruthlessly. He lists them. The adventurer and the pirate, the wholesale grocer and the ship owner, the gold digger and the merchant, all driven by appetite and force.
It shifts the focus immediately, doesn't it? Away from national glory or religious duty and straight on to the internal needs of capitalism, that relentless search for markets, cheap labor, raw materials.
Extending the competition between nations onto a global scale.
Yeah.
And he draws this really powerful distinction about the timeline of the hypocrisy, too.
How so?
He notes that the original guys, the plunderers like Cortez, Pizarro, they never really claimed they were bringing some superior moral system.
They were just there for the gold, basically.
Yeah, they were there to kill and plunder. In a dark way, he implies they were almost more honest. Just plain brigands.
So the intellectual dishonesty, the sort of moral rot, that came later.
That came later. It was the slavering apologists who followed. And he puts a lot of blame on what he calls Christian pedantry, which set up this fundamentally racist and, colonial equation. Christianity equals civilization, paganism equals savagery.
And that equation gives you the moral cover you need.
Absolutely. It's the indispensable moral framework required to justify destroying entire non-European cultures without feeling any consequence to your own European soul.
But that's the original sin, then? Building legitimacy on a self-serving fiction.
hmm But here, Césaire does something interesting. He pauses, grants a theoretical point, which actually strengthens his main argument later.
What's that?
He acknowledges that, okay, contact and exchange between different civilizations, that's inherently good. He calls it the oxygen for dynamic societies. He even praises Europe for its good fortune in being a historical crossroads of ideas.
Okay, so he's not anti-contact.
Not inherently. But the generosity kind of stops there, because he immediately hits you with a follow-up question. Has colonization truly put civilizations in contact? Was this incredibly destructive process the best way, or even a necessary way, to make that happen?
And his answer is,
A definitive no. He says between colonization and true civilization, there's an infinite distance. He argues that from all the colonial expeditions, all the bureaucratic rules, all the subjugation, there could not come a single human value.
so the moment contact becomes domination, it stops being civilizing.
Precisely. The potential value is destroyed by the method.
Okay, so if the intellectual foundation is a lie, then the consequences, morally, psychologically, they must be catastrophic. Which brings us to Césaire's big idea, right? The way this violence travels back.
Yes, this is where Césaire really shines as a critical theorist, I think. The boomerang effect, it's his central analysis of how colonization actually operates.
Okay.
It argues that the colonizer himself is decivilized. He's brutalized by the very act of colonizing. It's like a moral disease that spreads backward, infecting the source.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanism of that. It's not just about feeling guilty, is it? He's talking about something deeper, a systemic kind of spiritual decay.
Exactly. It's systemic. Césaire describes every act of violence committed overseas. You know, the administrative murder, the torture, the summary execution, the casual disregard for human life. Each one adds a dead weight back onto European civilization. It spreads, he says, like a gangrene or a center of infection.
How does that work psychologically on the colonizer?
Well, to do these horrible things and still be able to look himself in the mirror, the colonizer has to habitually treat the colonized person as an animal. He has to dehumanize them in his own mind to justify his actions.
Right.
But in doing so, Césaire argues, through that constant psychological effort of maintaining the violent lie, the colonizer objectively transforms himself into an animal.
Wow. So you can't practice savagery abroad and just expect to remain civilized and untouched back home.
That's the core of it. The spiritual cost of maintaining this constant globalized violence demands a kind of fundamental self-deception that poisons the soul of the metropole, the home country.
And this spiritual decay, this self-brutalization, this is what provides the bridge to Césaire's most, well, controversial and powerful historical claim, isn't it?
It is the direct structural link he draws between European colonial practice and the rise, and crucially, the toleration of Nazism.
Yeah, this is where it gets really, really intense, because for a text written in 1955, just a decade after the war, this is an explosive claim to make.
Absolutely explosive. Césaire argues that the European bourgeoisie, the class that really drove and benefited from the colonial project, they were genuinely shocked by the Gestapo, by the concentration camps, the torture happening in Europe.
But he says they were complicit. How?
He says they were accomplices because they tolerated Nazism before it came home to roost. They even legitimized elements of his ideology through their inaction. And why? Because until Hitler applied these methods, this total disregard for human life and dignity, it had only been applied to non-European peoples.
Ah, so it was okay when it was happening to the Arabs in Algeria, or the forced laborers in the Congo, or the coolies in Indochina.
That's precisely his point. The European pseudo-humanist, the bourgeois leader, wasn't shocked by the crime against man itself, but by the crime being applied to the wrong people, the white man.
So the horror wasn't the atrocity itself, but its location and the race of the victim.
Exactly. Césaire makes this critical distinction. They couldn't forgive Hitler for the crime against the white man, the humiliation of the white man, because he dared to apply colonialist procedures within Europe. It was the geography and the race of the victim that finally triggered the moral outrage, not the fundamental nature of the act.
That is Ishustin, an absolutely unforgiving critique of racialized morality. He's essentially saying Europe's moral compass was always broken, always geographically and racially biased.
And that Nazism wasn't some alien aberration, it was the boomerang coming back. An inevitable result, Césaire implies, of the rotten moral logic inherent in colonization itself.
Which leads him right into his critique of what he calls pseudo-humanism.
Yeah, which he just dismisses as narrow and fragmentary, incomplete and biased, and, all things considered, sordidly racist. In Césaire's terrifying view, the logical endpoint of this globalized, exploitative capitalism trying to prolong its own existence, is Hitler.
Okay, so if the colonizer is brutalized by this process, what about the colonized? You mentioned thingification.
Right. That's Césaire's core equation for the impact on the colonized. Colonization equals thingification, turning people into things, objects, instruments.
And he contrasts this with the claims of progress the colonizers always made, doesn't he?
He does. He systematically dismantles it. They point to statistics, miles of roads built, canals dug, diseases supposedly cured, tons of cotton exported.
The infrastructure argument.
The infrastructure argument. But Césaire asks, at what cost? What's the human cost of that so-called progress?
And the reality he paints is just catastrophic.
Utterly. Societies drained of their very essence, cultures trampled underfoot, traditional institutions completely undermined or destroyed.
And the sources, they detailed the incredible human cost of forced labor, too. Césaire specifically mentions the thousands sacrificed just to build one railway, the Congo Ocean Railway.
Yeah, a project where people were literally treated as expendable units of production. He talks about millions of men and women torn from their gods, their land, their habits, their life, from the dance, from wisdom, just ripped out of their context.
And the economic impact, beyond just the forced labor.
Equal devastating. He points out how natural economies, which had often been sustainable and viable for the local populations for centuries, were just completely disrupted.
How?
Well, food crops that people relied on to eat were systematically destroyed or discouraged, replaced by cash crops, things like cotton, coffee, rubber crops, intended only for export back to the metropole.
Which leads directly to...
It's a permanent malnutrition, even famine, in regions that had previously been perfectly capable of feeding themselves. The indigenous person is reduced, fundamentally, to an instrument of production, a thing.
And it's crucial, isn't it, that Césaire makes a point of defending the pre-colonial societies that were destroyed. He doesn't romanticize them, but he pushes back against the idea they were just primitive voids waiting for Europe.
Absolutely. That's a really important and often overlooked part of his argument. He highlights key features that stand in stark contrast to the capitalist brutality that replaced them. He stresses they were overwhelmingly communal societies, meaning they weren't structured for the benefit of a tiny elite at the expense of the many. And critically, he asserts they weren't just anti-capitalist, like some earlier stage on the way to capitalism.
All right.
But they were fundamentally anti-capitalist in their values and structures. They were often democratic, he says, fraternal, and they kept hope intact.
So, by contrast, he basically says European colonial ventures were just failures, morally and culturally.
Yes. He concludes they deserve only the words failure and avatar, like a pale, distorted imitation of real civilization. His point is that global culture was made poorer, not richer, by colonization. What was destroyed wasn't just primitive, it was culturally rich, often morally grounded, and in terms of human solidarity, maybe structurally superior to the extractive system that crushed it.
Okay, so Césaire has indicted the violence, the economics, the psychology of colonialism. Now he turns his fire, as you mentioned, on the intellectuals, the watchdogs.
Yeah, the writers, the philosophers, the academics, even the theologians who provided the intellectual and moral cover for all this brutality. He holds them directly answerable, he says, for the violence of revolutionary action that inevitably follows.
Because they supplied the language, the justifications, that Christian pedantry you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. They masked the actions of the wholesale grocer. Césaire attacks their whole concept of human rights as narrow, fragmentary, and ultimately just sordidly racist. They provided the essential psychological cover for the atrocities.
And he names names. His prime target seems to be Ernest Renan.
Oh, absolutely. Renan, the famous French historian and philosopher, the supposed idealist. Césaire dissects his work, particularly La Réforme intellectuelle et morale, because Renan basically provided the philosophical scaffolding for imperial rule.
What did Renan actually say?
Well, Renan wrote explicitly that the regeneration of the inferior or degenerate races by the superior races is part of the providential order of things for humanity. It's divine providence, apparently.
Wow. And he actually categorized races.
Oh, yes. In shocking detail and with utter certainty. He decreed the European race was destined to be masters and soldiers, the Negro race, meant for tillers of the soil, who should be treated with kindness and humanity, and then everything will be fine.
And the Chinese?
Dismissed as merely workers with wonderful manual dexterity and almost no sense of honor. It's just blatant.
And Césaire's reaction to this?
He says this language, even though it's couched in these lofty terms of providential order, is essentially the language of howling savagery. It shows, for Césaire, the intellectual decline of the European bourgeoisie. When a ruling class starts babbling to justify itself, it produces this kind of cold, calculated, almost mystical racism.
And this kind of justification came from all corners, right? Not just philosophy. You mentioned politicians, clergy, definitely.
Césaire experienced this directly as a political figure. He quotes M. Albert Sorel, who was a former governor-general of Indochina. Sorel put forward the legalistic defense.
How did that work?
Sorel argued against what he called the puerile childish objection. The people had some inherent right to possess the land they lived on. He claimed that resources, land, wealth, if they weren't being utilized properly.
Meaning exploited in a Western capitalist way.
Precisely. If they weren't being used that way by incompetents or savages, then they couldn't just be allowed to lie idle. It was practically a duty to take them.
That's basically a justification for global theft dressed up as efficiency.
Pretty much. And then you had the theological wing backing this up. Césaire mentions Reverends Bardet and Muller.
And their argument.
They claim that if the world's goods remain divided up indefinitely by these uncivilized peoples, it would actually violate God's purposes and the just demands of the human collectivity.
So imperialism becomes a moral imperative ordained by God.
Effectively, yes. It weaponizes Christian theology to claim a divine right to plunder the globe.
It's chilling how systematic all these justifications were. But Césaire goes even further, right, into psychoanalysis, with M. Mannoni in Madagascar. You could argue this one is the most insidious.
Oh, Mannoni's analysis is particularly revealing, and Césaire really skewers it. Mannoni used psychoanalytic terms to propose this idea of a dependency complex.
A dependency complex, what does that mean?
He argued that colonized groups, specifically the Malagasy people he was studying, were somehow psychologically structured for dependence, that they actually craved it. Unlike Westerners, apparently the Malagasy never felt the psychological need to break free from authority figures.
So when the Madagascans revolted, like they did violently in 1947, how did Mannoni explain that if they supposedly craved dependence?
Well, conveniently, he dismissed this huge political uprising as just neurotic behavior, a collective outburst, a search for imaginary security, rather than seeing it as a legitimate fight for self-determination.
Pathologizing resistance.
Exactly. And here's the absolute core of Césaire's critique of Mannoni. The analyst goes on to suggest that the colonialists who were demanding bloody suppression of the revolt, they were actually acting on a fairly accurate perception of the emotional disturbances of the people.
Wait, what? So the violence was therapeutic?
That's the implication. The revolts, in this incredibly warped view, were almost necessary for the colonized to symbolically sacrifice their gods, the white colonizers, in some kind of twisted rite of passage to psychological health. It's using the language of science to excuse brutality and absolve the colonizer entirely.
Turning oppression into a form of therapy. Wow. Césaire also takes aim at geographical arguments, right? Like M. Guru.
Yeah, the geographical determinism argument. Guru claimed that great civilizations have existed only in temperate climates. He argued the actual germ of civilization could only come from outside the tropics.
The old geographical curse idea.
Right. Which conveniently makes the colonial relationship seem natural, even permanent. Tropical peoples are just condemned by their geography to need external civilized intervention forever.
Did Guru acknowledge the suffering at all?
To be fair, Césaire Guru did point out the suffering caused by things like forced labor. But ultimately, Guru kind of backed away from condemning the system itself, saying the suffering only exists within the framework of colonial capitalism, which, Césaire jumps in to say, is itself perishable.
And finally, there's the theological manipulation in the Congo with Reverend temples and Bantu philosophy. This seems particularly opportunistic.
Oh, it's a devastating example of intellectual colonialism. Temples wrote about the complex Bantu worldview, which involved life forces flowing from God through a hierarchy.
Okay.
But then, Temples very conveniently integrated the Belgian colonizer at the very top of this traditional Bantu hierarchy of life forces.
So the colonizer becomes divinely sanctioned within the indigenous belief system itself.
Well, exactly. Making the Belgian king or the governor part of the natural, even divine order.
Which means resisting Belgian rule becomes
sacrilege. An offense against the proper order of life forces.
Yeah.
And the practical effect, Césaire points out, was brilliant in its cynicism. It shifted the focus away from concrete, material demands, things like fair wages, decent housing, political rights.
Things that cost money and power.
Right. Away from those things, towards merely seeking ontological recognition, just asking for respect for their dignity within that imposed colonial hierarchy. Respect is cheap. wages and independence are not.
It's a sophisticated way to keep people materially subjugated while making them feel spiritually acknowledged within the system that's oppressing them.
Precisely. And Césaire ties all these figures together. The philosopher, the politician, the psychoanalyst, the geographer, the theologian, they are all watchdogs. They are all, regardless of their personal intentions perhaps, functionally serving the colonial machine. And he notes they're increasingly forced to drop subtle arguments and just resort to outright philosophical brutality to justify the unjustifiable.
Okay, so having just comprehensively dismantled the colonial structure and its intellectual defenses, Césaire knows he needs to offer something else, right? A vision for the future.
Yes, he's acutely aware of that. And he directly addresses the critics who are already accusing him of being, an enemy of Europe or some kind of prophet of return, someone just wanting to go back to a mythical pre-contact past.
Which wasn't his point at all.
Not at all. He makes it really clear. The goal isn't some utopian and sterile attempt to repeat the past. The challenge is to go beyond both the pre-colonial past and the colonial present, to create something new.
A synthesis.
Exactly. A new society that is, in his words, rich with all the productive power of modern times, warm with all the fraternity of olden days. But achieving that synthesis required a revolution, not just in politics, but in consciousness too.
And that revolution, for him, started with language, didn't it? In the interview, he talks about this profound break he had to make.
He does. A literary and psychological break from the dominance of French influence. He said he found the traditional French literary forms, the whole canon, just crushing.
So how did he become a poet then?
Paradoxically, he says, by renouncing poetry, by which he meant renouncing the rigid aesthetic rules and expectations imposed by the French Academy. That's what led him to the radical prose poem format of his seminal work, Return to My Native Land, which he wrote when he was remarkably young, only about 26.
He felt he needed a new kind of language to express something French rationalism couldn't capture.
Precisely. And he found a weapon, as he calls it, in surrealism, which might seem like an odd choice given surrealism's European avant-garde roots.
Yeah, how did that fit with an anti-colonial project?
Well, he wasn't interested in surrealism for its purely aesthetic qualities, art for art's sake. He saw it as a political tool, a tool of rupture. He described it as a weapon that exploded the French language.
Exploded it.
For Césaire, the techniques of surrealism, like automatic writing, the focus on the subconscious, the juxtaposition of unexpected images, allowed him to plumb the depths of his own consciousness, to dig underneath the layers of colonial education and find what was fundamentally, authentically black. It was a process he called disalienation.
Disalienation. Let's pause on that. For you listening, this means freeing your deepest self from all those layers imposed from outside: the French customs, the colonial schooling, the Cartesian philosophy, everything that taught colonized people, essentially, to hate their own reflection, to feel ashamed of their heritage.
Exactly. It was a kind of necessary cultural violence against the internalized colonization, a way to reclaim a sense of selfhood. And this cultural break, this act of disalienation, is what directly gave birth to negritude.
Which wasn't just his idea alone, right?
No, he always stressed it was a collective creation, developed alongside Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal and Léon Damas from French Guiana. And fundamentally, negritude was a resistance movement against that pervasive French policy of assimilation.
Right, the policy that basically told colonial subjects, the best you can hope for is to become as French as possible. Forget your own culture.
Yeah. And Césaire says this policy led to a psychological condition he calls Bovarism.
Like Madame Bovary.
Exactly like Madame Bovary, the Flaubert character, who is always yearning for a life that isn't hers, always dissatisfied with her reality. Applied here, Bovarism describes this profound self-denial where Black people felt ashamed of being Negroes. They were constantly searching for euphemisms: man of color, Afro-descendant, anything but Black. Negritude was a direct rejection of that assimilationist shame.
So they deliberately took the term Negro, which was often used as an insult,
And they adopted it as a term of defiance. They reclaimed the pejorative, flipped it, and turned it into a badge of honor, a source of affirmation.
So negritude is more than just pride then. It's a conscious political and cultural act.
Very much so. Césaire describes it as a concrete coming to consciousness. It was about affirming Black pride, yes, but also Black history, and crucially, the belief that Africa wasn't the blank page the colonizers claimed it was, that it held its own universalizing, living values.
So the aim wasn't just to reject Europe, but to assert that Africa and the Black diaspora had their own unique, essential contribution to make to global culture.
Precisely. It wasn't about being dazzled by European civilization, but about finding and asserting their own sources of strength and value.
And Césaire points to Haiti as a key example of negritude in action, doesn't he?
He does. He calls Haiti the heroic Antilles, the cradle of negritude. Why? Because Haiti, through its successful slave revolution and independence struggle, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, wrote the first epic chapter of Black liberation in the New World.
They proved it could be done.
They proved the colonial system wasn't invincible and that Black self-affirmation could translate directly into political freedom.
Okay, one last point on this section. Césaire also explains why his political projects sometimes clashed with the mainstream Communist Party line at the time, particularly the French Communist Party.
Right. He argued that standard class analysis, while important, didn't fully capture the situation of Black people. They were victims, he said, of a double alienation.
Double how?
Well, first, they were alienated as workers, as part of the proletariat exploited by capitalism. That's the classic Marxist analysis.
Okay.
But second, they were alienated specifically as Blacks, because colonialism and racism denied their entire race even the notion of humanity. Their very being was under attack.
So their liberation needed more than just an economic revolution.
Yes. It required a profound cultural decolonization, too.
Yeah.
One that specifically recognized and affirmed the values of negritude. He felt they needed to sort of complete Marx by recognizing that the Black question was both social and ontological about existence itself.
So Césaire brings this whole powerful argument full circle in the final section. He's basically warning that Europe's moral sickness, its colonial policies, they aren't just abstract philosophical problems, they're actively paving the way for Europe's own destruction.
Exactly. He uses this really potent historical parallel, quoting the historian Edgar Quinet on the fall of the Roman Empire.
Well, what was Quinet's point about Rome?
Quinet argued that Rome, by systematically destroying other nationalities, Carthage, Greece, Judea, wiping out their distinct identities, essentially destroyed the dikes that protected it. It created this huge, empty, uniform space around itself, a spiritual and political void, which made it vulnerable and ultimately led to its collapse when the barbarians arrived.
And Césaire sees bourgeois Europe doing the same thing.
Precisely. By undermining other civilizations, destroying distinct cultures, extirpating what he calls the root of diversity through the lie of colonization, Europe has foolishly eliminated the very bulwarks, the cultural diversity, needed for its own long-term defense and resilience. No diversity, no strength.
It's strategic suicide, culturally speaking.
That's the implication. And Césaire then identifies the new, modern barbarian that he sees, ready to step into the void created by a weakened, morally bankrupt Europe.
And that is?
American domination. He views the rise of American influence not as some benign force of liberation, but as the inevitable and perhaps even more dangerous successor to European colonialism.
Wow. He calls American domination the only domination from which one never recovers unscarred. That's incredibly strong.
It is. And remember, this is 1955. America was publicly promoting anti-colonialism in some ways, offering aid, bulldozers, as Césaire mockingly puts it. But he warns the colonized world, don't mistake this for genuine liberation.
Why not? What's the specific danger of American influence as he sees it?
It's not just economic exploitation in the old European style, though there's that too. He fears a more total, crushing cultural degradation. He describes the American system in terrifying terms, a tremendous factory hysterically spitting out its cinders for the production of lackeys.
Lackeys.
Yeah. He sees it as a giant machine for crushing, for grinding, for degrading peoples. An industrialized system designed for cultural leveling, producing a kind of uniform subservience, stripping away unique identities.
So, given this bleak picture, where does Césaire see any hope? Any salvation for Europe?
Well, he's very clear it's not going to come from just changing colonial methods slightly or tweaking administrative policies. It requires nothing less than the revolution.
Meaning?
Europe must replace the narrow tyranny of the dehumanized bourgeoisie, the class he identified as the main driver of colonization, with the leadership of the only class he believes still has a universal mission. The proletariat.
Because the proletariat, being the victim of the internal problem, class exploitation, is the only group positioned to solve both the class problem and the colonial problem together.
That's his Marxist analysis, yes. Only a revolution led by the working class, allied with the colonized peoples, can break the cycle.
And his final ultimatum to Western Europe is pretty stark, isn't it?
Incredibly stark and immediate. He says, unless Europe undertakes, right now, a genuine policy of nationalities, based on real immediate respect for different peoples and cultures, And unless it actively works to galvanize the dying cultures or raise up new ones,
Then what?
then it will have drawn the pall of mortal darkness over itself. It seals its own doom.
So for Césaire, diversity, the thriving life of distinct cultures, these aren't liabilities or obstacles. They're the absolute essential protective bulwarks against these monolithic, brutal, dehumanizing systems.
Exactly. And by destroying that diversity through colonization, Europe basically guarantees its own eventual ruin. That's the final chilling warning. #outro.
Well, this deep dive into Aimé Césaire's Discourse on colonialism, it really gives you the blueprint for understanding so much anti-colonial thought, doesn't it? It shows why he remains just so central for anyone studying decolonial theory today.
Absolutely. We've traced how he argues European moral decadence is fundamentally rooted in the colonial project. We've looked at that chilling boomerang effect, linking colonial brutality directly to the horrors of Nazism. And we've explored his proposed solution, negritude, not just as cultural pride, but as a necessary radical act of disalienation, of cultural self-affirmation against the crushing weight of assimilation.
Yeah, and what really stands out, I think, is Césaire's relentless insistence on seeing racism and colonial ideology not just as, bad individual attitudes, but as systemic intellectual necessities for justifying the unjustifiable.
Right. When a dying society, desperate to hang on to its power, starts to babble, as he puts it, it produces these intellectual horrors. We talked about the cold, philosophical brutality of Renan or the cynical, pathologizing pseudoscience of Mannoni. Reading these texts forces you to grasp the deep structural nature of oppression.
And the ultimate lesson he leaves us with is that stark warning about the fragility of any civilization that cuts itself off. Europe, he concludes, if it's not careful, will perish from the void it has created around itself.
Which really leaves us with a necessary, I think, and provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward from this. Césaire maintained that diversity, that network of distinct cultures, was Europe's essential life support.
So the question for us today is...
What cultures, what institutions, what ways of knowing or being are we maybe allowing to atrophy? Things we might dismiss as separate or inferior or maybe just unprofitable, which might actually turn out to be the essential bulwarks, the very things we need for our own collective, moral, and societal survival.
Definitely food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the indispensable and still fiery work of Aimé Césaire.
We'll see you next time.